So we're going to get started. Good evening. If you could please take your seats. So welcome to the second Gordon Rausser keynote address and panel discussion this evening. It's been my pleasure to organize it, and I will be moderating the event today. I'm Madhu Khanna. I'm a professor in the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Economics at the University of Illinois. Before I introduce the speakers, I would just like to briefly provide some context for the particular topic that we've selected today, which is accelerating transformation towards a sustainable and circular food system. As you all know, AEA members have a long history of scholarship examining the environmental externalities caused by our agriculture and food system, and looking at economic approaches for addressing them, developing, doing analysis, looking at the effectiveness of various types of policies to rectify that. And we're now presented with an opportunity to collaborate with other professional associations that are converging on this grand challenge of transforming our food and agricultural system by reducing, reusing, and recycling agricultural and food waste. So in the fall of 2020, AEA was invited to join a coalition of societies together with the American Society for Ag and Biological Engineering, the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Sciences, and the Soil Science Society, that have come together to prioritize circular systems in agriculture and food as a critical problem to focus on. These societies have been brought together under the leadership of Dr. Jim Jones, who's here as one of our panelists today. And they're interested in looking at this issue from diverse perspectives and in an interdisciplinary way, and looking at ways in which we can collaborate to elevate the importance of this problem and find ways to address it. Dr. Jones has also proposed this as a priority to the Board of Agriculture and Natural Resources, or BANNER, that is part of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And so BANNER is now initiating a study and commissioning a task force that is going to be looking at this issue from various perspectives. So the session today is to raise awareness in our profession of the emerging national dialogue on this topic and the opportunities for collaborating with other disciplines to contribute to finding solutions and having an impact on this complex global challenge. We hope to bring more opportunities to the AEA members interested in engaging with this initiative in the coming months. And soon you'll be hearing about a workshop / conference that we're planning next year in Kansas City around this topic. And I'd be interested in hearing about, those of you who are interested in engaging with it and looking for ways in which we can build upon this, what we're starting today. We have 4 speakers today to represent views from different disciplines, different sectors on this topic. We'll start with a keynote address by Dr. Ricardo Salvador, and I'd like you to hold your questions to the end, and we will have time at that point for, after all the speakers have given their talks, to get into some question and answers. All right, let me introduce Dr. Salvador, and I'm hoping that he's all set on Zoom. Okay. So Dr. Salvador is an agronomist who has worked for over 40 years in academia, philanthropy, and advocacy to shape a more sustainable and socially equitable food system. Born and raised in southern Mexico, he completed his higher education at New Mexico State University and holds master's and PhD degrees in crop production and physiology from Iowa State University. He was a professor of agronomy at Iowa State before moving to the Union of Concerned Scientists, where he is now director and senior scientist of the Food and Environment Program. Dr. Ricardo leads a team of scientists, economists, and policy analysts to make the case that modern sustainable practices can be highly productive while also protecting the environment and producing healthy food and creating economic opportunity for all. He's a member of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food and of BANNER of the National Academies of Sciences and Engineering and Medicine. He's also advised a range of organizations, including the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, Food Corps, the Center for Good Food Purchasing, and many others. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ricardo to give his remarks.
Thank you very much, Madhu. I really appreciate this honor. It's a great opportunity for me to be able to speak to this group. And I very much regret that I'm not there in person to be able to more fluid part in the proceedings later on this evening, but I appreciate your flexibility in allowing me to do this virtually. I have the role of setting the stage, and I very much look forward to the remarks that are come later on from Professors Kling, Antle, and Jones, which, by the way, sounds like a name for a law firm. As this topic was presented to those of us on this panel, the session that we're beginning with has the express purpose of highlighting the pressing challenge of advancing environmental sustainability of our agriculture and food systems. And this is not an audience to which I need to elaborate the following point, but none of these concepts, either environmental sustainability or agriculture itself or food systems, have any meaning outside of human activity and human interests, with all of the subjectivity that that implies, all of the self-interest that that implies. And so for that reason, I'm going to be quite open about my own subjectivity on this topic, but I'm also appealing to all of you in that spirit of subjectivity for the major and fundamental changes that we all need to be a part of and advocate for, as well as for the flexibility that we all need to act on in order to be adapted and to adapt behaviors that you'll see I'm going to argue are quite antiquated, so that they match our current understanding of how our planet works and better serve our own self-interest. So to that end, I also want to let you know that if I manage this well, by the time that I'm done, I do want to make a very specific comment to this audience, as it was described to me, a set of the nation's intelligentsia on agriculture, to the effect of where I see the majority of us as actors in the drama of both understanding ourselves, but also the role that we play as leaders and advisors in the agri-food system, so that we have greater awareness of the behaviors that we rationalize and that we justify, most particularly in the political arena. So that's where I'm headed. But let me first of all do the work that I was assigned to do by setting the stage. So on the topic of circular economy, underlining economy, a very useful milestone to begin with for an audience in the United States is the year 1776, particularly because one of the arguments that I want to make is that we need to update severely antiquated economic notions. And that year is not particularly significant for the reason that probably most of you are thinking immediately, which was the Declaration of Independence, but rather, as this audience well knows, because of the publication of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which represented a formalization of decades of exchange among Smith and many other political economists and philosophers, moral philosophers, as you well know, on the basic question of whether human beings were intrinsically good or intrinsically evil, with a resolution arrived at and magnificently articulated in the Wealth of Nations that said we can actually pursue our self-interest and yet still obtain the greater common good with the mechanisms explicitly drawn out in the Wealth of Nations. So at the time that this nation's economic systems, its initial policies, its institutions were being established, our very first notions of economy, at least at a national scale, were being applied and formalized. And by that time, the eastern seaboard of the United States, the present United States, had actively been explored, colonized, and settled by Europeans for over 160 years. So there was already experience in terms of getting to know the continent on the part of European settlers. And so at that time, as those settlers documented themselves, they surveyed and toward the west, it did seem to them like the territory and the environment and the resources of the colonized land that they were expanding into was going to be an infinite source of materials, as well as an infinite sink for their wastes. At that time, the global population is estimated to have been a little bit shy of 1 billion, and compare that to today's 8 billion, just a little bit shy of 8 billion population. So not only is our capacity to draw on the resources of the planet, but also our capacity to generate waste much greater today, not just numerically, but because of the intensity of our resource use, because of our technological approach. We can now no longer actually assume many of the things that the population at that time thought was logical to believe, particularly the issue about the relative infinity of resources available and the relative buffering capacity of the environment to absorb the wastes that we generate. Neither of those assumptions are true today. And yet, we instituted a system at that time that I'll dare say now has turned into a culture that actually sanctions both extractive as well as polluting behavior. In other words, the degradation of the environment and the accumulation of waste beyond the buffering capacity of the environment to absorb those. And this leads to all kinds of distortions in pricing today, where you folks are the actual experts, where we actually see as costs the need to actually begin to internalize some of those expenses, some of those real costs. Because I've been thinking about this, my eye was drawn to a review that was published this morning in the New York Times that many of you may have seen, which is a review of a British sheep farmer by the name of James Rebanks, who just published a book called Pastoral Song. And the reviewer states the following: the answer that Rebanks gives to the question posed up front, how to make money from land without wrecking it, is an honest and difficult one. You can't. He doesn't. Not in his corner of the world, under the current system. Rebanks. I knew that if we farmed in more sustainable ways and no one wanted to pay us to do that, then we would just go bankrupt. I cite this as an example of one of those distortions created by assumptions that are centuries old and which are difficult for us to with the economic paradigms and the culture that have grown up around our 18th century and 17th century worldviews. Here's another example from The Guardian last Wednesday. It's an article that talks about President Bolsonaro's intention to construct a road and railway system to get soybeans out of deep Amazonia, deeply affecting the integrity of the Amazon forest. Here's the quotation from David Miranda. This underscores a key point of tension between Brazil and the international community. One reason the Amazon, a massive carbon bank, is so crucial to global climate policy is that countries in the global north became rich by exploiting their own natural resources, including through massive deforestation. Now that Western European and North American countries are economically developed, they demand that Brazilians not do what they did, exploit our environmental resources so that we too can thrive economically. Many Brazilians understandably resent the hypocrisy. So as I've stated, you are the actual experts in some of the quandaries, some of the inconsistencies that have been created by the phenomenon that I'm describing. More recently, just about 3 weeks ago, if I'm not mistaken, the Rockefeller Foundation issued a report that they commissioned to take a look at the true cost of food, meaning if we did internalize all of the costs that we've been essentially pushing off the books over the last few centuries, what would the actual cost of food be? And of course, they were as conservative as possible in drawing up their estimate, but they concluded that conservatively, food should cost at least 3 times what we're actually paying in the United States, just to give us the baseline understanding of the magnitude of the externalization. So let's come to circular economies. So the idea of circular economies today is supported by international coalitions, by national initiatives, particularly by the states of the Northern European Union, and by an emerging ISO standard. However, the idea is not as well understood, it is not as familiar to people in the United States, so I want to allay some potential concerns that might be out there. If you're not familiar with this notion, you would be right to be cautious, to be wary of the implications of the concept of circularity. which is, of course, that of a perfectly closed economy. So I want to put your mind at ease. This is not what this is about. It is a well-developed idea that's not referring to utopian autarkies or to the economic equivalent of a perpetual motion machine. These, of course, are physical and economical impossibilities. Instead, what this is the recognition that those 18th and 19th century worldviews that I just described getting us into cultural problems today, and which dominate our present economic and political thinking, which sanction extractive and complete open economies, these are wasteful, and we obviously can do better than that. The idea is, where possible, to close material loops as much as feasible so that we can extend the usefulness of those materials once they've been extracted, and by extension, also extend the viability of lifestyles that depend on those extracted materials. So just because I've raised the topic and because I want you to be completely at ease that we're not talking hocus pocus here, we all need to recognize, as the scientists that we are, that the planet Earth is viable because, in fact, we live in an open energy system. We're all contingent on the energy that is input to the planet by solar radiation. And in fact, I'll make two quick comments about that. One, we have managed over the last couple of centuries to actually boost productivity by taking fossil solar energy, as you well know, but we need to get beyond our utilization of fossil fuel energy because of the limitations on the availability of that material, and learn to live on the concurrent solar energy and the closely allied energies, wind energy, and so on. And that energy we use to reshape materials, and that is more of a closed economy. We have the finite supply of materials that are on this planet for which we need energy to be able to reshape them and bend them to our needs. So hopefully that gives some parameters around whether we need to be worried about the concept of circular economies being a flaky concept. It is a well-developed idea, and to that end, I want to quote to you a study just from last year from PACE. If you're not familiar with PACE, it is the Platform for Accelerating the Circular Economy, where they did a very rigorous assessment of the degree of circularity in the global economy. I'll explain that in just a little bit, but here's the punchline. Their estimate is that the global economy is currently only 8.6% circular, and that this trend is actually worsening rather than improving. Just a few years earlier, when they first tested out their methodology, they estimated it at around 9.1% circularity. The major components of the extraction that lead to waste, that's linearly, are all implicated in the dominant agricultural system. So we all need to care about this. Mineral extraction accounts for 51% of that linearity, ore extraction for 10%, fossil fuel extraction for 15%, and biomass, primarily through forestry and the degradation of soils for agriculture, accounts for 25%. So while we all agreed that 100% circularity is not possible, I think we can also all agree that we can do better than 8.6% reuse of the materials, those minerals, the fertilizers, the ores, the fossil fuel, and the biomass that go through the agri-food system. So what will this look like? So I have been privileged to see the comments that we're going to be hearing from, again, Professors Kling, Antle, and Jones. And so they will be addressing some of this, and I'm not going to steal their thunder. But the major idea is that we need to establish standards, and we need to establish collaboration. Professor Jones in particular is going to talk about collaboration across societies, but this collaboration needs to be throughout entire value chains, which these days are global, which means that nations need to establish cradle to cradle, not cradle to grave, but cradle to cradle management and design of value chains so that we know what we're going to do with materials once we get to the second cradle and think about their reuse. Because we are intervening in a global system, I'll just give you an example in global climate change, the atmosphere. There's many other examples where political boundaries are ridiculous. They make no sense. Once we intervene in this system, we're intervening in a global biophysical system. Then the collaboration to manage the effects of our intervention needs, by extension, to also be an international collaborative approach. PACE, the group that I described, defines as their major objective to establish an ecologically safe and socially just operating space for mankind. So this means that we measure our success not just in terms of the material extraction that we're successfully able to attain in the wealth or the capital that we're able to generate as a result of that material extraction, but that we must go to the next two steps, which is to translate that into general social well-being and equitable social well-being, so that we get away from the distortion that if individual nations or individual corporations within nations attain a high degree of capital accumulation or well-being, but it is not spread to the entire economy, that we don't call that success. So the summary is we need to have standards, we need to have international cooperation, and so you know what that leads to. That leads to policy change. So this means that nations will need to assert their sovereignty over the interests of corporations, which is an important thing to mention because many global corporations these days are more powerful than many governments and can dictate their needs and their interests to national governments. We don't have time here to get into the implications for the social contract that governs at least Western economies, but of course this is rooted in the proper role of the national government and the proper role of the private sector. So let me bring this to a close by addressing the issue that I mentioned that I would end with, which is the particular role that those of us here, the Intelligentsia that works in economy and in the science of the agri-food system. If you step back and take a look at what some of what I've described in the big picture, this is a learning for me. It's easy for me now that I stepped out of academia and I live in the advocacy world to be conscious of what I'm about to describe to you, but I did begin to learn about this even when I was within academia. If you look at the big picture of how the institution that we worked in as academics, that I worked in, that you currently work in as academics, if you look at the establishment of that institution, it was established by, for, and with the interest of the colonists and settlers in mind. It is developed into an organization, an institution that works hand in glove with the private sector. I'm not criticizing that, but I am asking for more critical awareness of the fact that, in essence, that whenever we have tensions, I'll just be very crass here, between the interest of capital and labor, or the interest of managers and labor, the interest of owners and labor, that without realizing it, academia works hand in glove with the interest of capital, the private sector, and not so much with any awareness of the interest of labor. It isn't until very recently that some of those interests have actually begun to awaken within the academic sector, at least in my experience. So as we begin to work into thinking about a more circular economy and the goal that PACE has set, specifically that we're not just about generating wealth in the abstract and well-being in the abstract, but about generating actual equity for everybody in society. We need to think about the role that academia plays and who our allies have been traditionally, particularly since policy change is about competing political interests, meaning the power that individual sectors will have to get their way in terms of the rules of the game, not only just in terms of the rules of the economy, but I mean actual legislation, the actual rules by which the nation operates. So hopefully there's plenty of grist there for discussion. And as I've mentioned, I now look very much forward to the comments that we're going to have from my colleagues on the panel. And I believe I'll need to now turn it over either back to you, Maru, or to Professor Jones. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ricardo. All right, I'll introduce our three panelists next. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Jim Jones. Dr. Jones is a distinguished professor emeritus in the Agriculture and Biological Engineering Department at the University of Florida with a PhD from North Carolina State University. He's an international leader in mathematical modeling of cropping systems and use of these models at farm, national, and international scales. He recently served as the program director in the NSF, where he co-led the multi-directorate funding initiative Infuse, or Innovations at the Nexus of Food, Energy, and Water Systems, and has also led the development of a new cross-directorate funding opportunity called Signals in the Soil. He's served on the National Academy of Sciences. He's helped to lead new initiatives to increase the circularity of food and ag systems, to achieve production, environmental sustainability, and resource conservation goals at the NAS and the NSF. He's a member of the National Academy of Engineering and a fellow of the AAAS, the ASABE, the ASA, and the SSA professional societies. Following him, Dr. John Antle will be talking, and John is a professor in the Department of Applied Economics at Oregon State University in Oregon. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Chicago and is a founding member of the executive committee of the AgMIP, which is the Agriculture Model into Comparison and Improvement Project. His research focuses on improving the sustainability of agricultural systems. He served on the President's Council of Economic Advisors, is a fellow and past president of AEA, and has received several awards from the AEA, as well as from the Presidential Award from the American Society of Agronomy and the USDA's Abraham Lincoln Award. And lastly, we will hear from Dr. Cathy Kling. She is the Tisch University professor in the Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management and faculty director at the Atkinson Center for a Sustainable Future in Cornell University. She's past director of CARD at Iowa State University, has served for many years at EPA's Science Advisory Board, and was elected to the National Academy of Sciences in 2015. Cathy specializes in the economic valuation of ecosystem services, externalities from agriculture production, and integrated assessment modeling of water quality. She chairs the Water Science and Technology Board of the National Academy of Sciences, serves as the editor of the Review of Environmental Economics and Policy, and is an elected fellow of both AEA and AERE. So, Dr. Jones, we'll start with your remarks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khanna, for the introduction and also for the opportunity to be here. This is my first meeting to an AAEA meeting, and I'm privileged to have this opportunity to talk with you today. I will be representing the American Society of Agricultural and Biological Engineering, or ASABE, as Dr. Khanna pointed out, in some of the activities that we're working on in that professional society. I'll summarize why we're doing this and why we studied it internally, and we thought that this is something that we really needed to focus on. And they've now developed a long-term priority on this within this society, and also working with other professional societies, as Dr. Khanna pointed out. And we need the agricultural and applied economics folks to be on board from the start. And that's, I hope that becomes clear toward the end of my talk today. But I do want to point out that first of all, that our food and agricultural systems are really impressive here. Yes, they've been extractive, as Dr. Salvador pointed out, but we are fortunate to have the opportunity to go to most of our retail outlets, and we find the things that we need on the shelves, and so our systems are technologically oriented. They're advanced. They supply our current needs, but the changes are essential to these systems. In the figure here on the very bottom, you'll see, going from left to right, the approximately linear systems that many of our supply chains are, where resources go into the pre-production phase of facilities development, the land preparation. Then it goes, there's production, and then there's post-production processing and transportation and packaging of the food and other agricultural products, and then goes into consumptions. And the thing I want to point out on this slide is that there are resources that go in on the top, on the green line, and they go into all of these. And one can calculate through life cycle assessment tools, the carbon footprints and the water footprints and the nitrogen footprints and the land footprints according to these various inputs that accumulate as we go through that chain. One of the most important things about this slide, though, is you see at the bottom that there are a lot of losses and waste that are somewhat discarded because we've disconnected our production systems from the abilities to recycle things on the same land that where we have production. For example, our soybean and corn production in the U.S., a lot of that goes to feed livestock, which are located at different locations. And so it's more difficult and more challenging to address some of those issues about circularity that need to be addressed in our systems. And the other thing I wanted to point out on this slide is that our ASABE members contribute to all of those cycles, all of those steps along the chain. And that's why it makes sense for us as a professional society to embrace this and see if there's a way that we can unify our different engineers that are working on different components across the system. And this goes all the way including the waste management and transformation of that waste into fertilizers or energy or other products that will keep these products in use. Next, I guess I have the production here. And so we arrived at, and looking at the recent literature and some of the early literature on circular economies, and we thought, well, some of the recent literature has made it more concrete in terms of how we might try to approach this in our professional society. And we centered on this Ellen MacArthur Foundation series of reports that focus on the 3 principles that organization says are really important if you want to rethink and reimagine and redesign systems. And this isn't just for food and agriculture, it's for all systems, for manufacturing, for construction, all of the human activities these principles can be applied so that we no longer are as extractive and we can increase the circularity that we have. And these 3 principles are, first, keep products and materials in use. Secondly, design out waste and pollution. And third, regenerate natural systems. And that's really important, I think, in our food and agricultural systems because of the soil and the water and the ecosystems generally where these things are produced. In internal studies that we had in our professional society, we studied a number of the different supply chains and looked at what the implications would be if we applied these principles and rethought the way these systems might evolve in the future to achieve some of these goals that have been mentioned earlier as well. And we found that one of the outcomes of this is that the systems would be more sustainable if you can apply these principles, more resource use efficient, even more productive if you look at the goal also of having increased productivity per unit of resource use. So we published on the slide here the results of these different teams that we're studying internal to ASABE in a special issue of Resource Journal that came out in March and April of this year. And you can go online and you can find that, and you will see sort of the history of and an overview of some of the things that we did together. And we concluded also, all of the different teams that were studying different kinds of systems concluded that, this is really a big problem. We can't do this alone. It's got to have other disciplines involved within the supply chain, such as agronomists and physiologists, plant breeders, soil scientists, and engineers that deal with separation of materials and transformation of materials into other things like chemical engineering and electrical engineering for sensors that will measure the things that need to be measured to create standards that Salvador talked about. So we've done that, and then in this study, we approached some of these other disciplines, including the AAEA, MADU, and suggested that they may want to take a look at it because we think this is something that all of us need to pay more attention to. And sure enough, all of the professional societies that are involved in the food chain or the supply chains are keenly interested now, and they're studying how they can work together to improve the technical or management-oriented interventions that can achieve some of these goals. And then this is the first paper that came out of that. That's a refereed journal article, and we just got news 2 days ago that this was accepted. And this was taking one particular component, and this is a component of grain production systems, and see if we could find a way to enable more circularity in these systems as subsystems of the whole supply chain. And Bruno Basso at Michigan State University, John Antle was our economist that worked with us on this, and myself. And so anyway, this told us that there are things that can be done now. There are things in the pipeline in terms of science and development, engineering that can be done in maybe the midterm. And then there's some longer term goals that were defined that technologies and understanding hasn't really advanced enough to make those happen. So I won't have time to go into that in detail. I'll be happy to answer questions, and I'll be sending Madhu the paper as soon as it comes out. But this is the plea to you. This is the more complicated system, and this is from the United Kingdom government that shows the supply and the demand side of the equation. And I know that's what a lot of economists work with appropriately, because it's much more complicated and complex than just looking at the supply side. And all of these other factors come in. I mean, consumer behavior, the policies that may enable or not enable progress along these lines, the resources that are becoming more and more limited, and the off-site effects that occur there. So there are a number of things, and Dr. Khanna mentioned some of these. There's also a workshop being held by the National Academy of Engineering on September the 9th, that there'll be different disciplines coming in. We'll have some economists there, as well as some engineers and some agronomists and social scientists there as well to do that. And so I would encourage you to help out with this. One of the things that we need to find out is, how do we best interface between the different scales, the scale that we're working on in the supply chain, but also the national and international scales. And I know some of you have been working on cross-scale communication of these kind of analysis, and we look forward to hopefully working with you some more on that in the future. So that's all, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
All right, we'll now move to the presentation by John Antler.
And I hope you can see me. I'd appreciate if somebody would just acknowledge that you can hear me and see me okay.
Yep, we can see you, John. So,
okay,
yep.
And it looks like I'm going to need to share my screen. Wasn't actually anticipating that, but I can do that. So are you guys seeing my screen now?
Yeah, we're seeing a screen. Yes, that's perfect.
Okay. Mm-hmm. All right. Excellent. Well, great. Well. So also, thank you so much for this opportunity to participate in this session. I really appreciated Ricardo's comments and would really love to have more opportunity to discuss these important issues. And it's great to see the societies come together across the relevant scientific disciplines to talk about this really major challenge that the world is facing about moving agriculture and food systems in more sustainable directions. I think we can all agree that that is indeed one of the great challenges we face in this century. And indeed, this idea of circularity, of course, in the old days we might have said recycling, is an important idea, and it's been talked about for a long time, and we've used it in various ways. And so it's interesting to see it be brought again forward as an important part of how we solve these important problems. What I'd like to do is just comment a little bit about what I see as the limits of circularity in moving towards that goal. And what I'm going to do, hopefully if my computer cooperates, there we go, is to just pull a couple examples from a book that I published last year with Sribashi Ray which is about sustainable agricultural development, coming at it from an economic perspective. And of course, our challenge is to move agriculture and food systems towards more sustainable development pathways. That's how we describe this challenge. And I'd like to just, like I said, use a couple examples from that to illustrate some of the concerns I have as we move forward in trying to use this idea. And so these are obviously very large, complex systems. They're diverse, they're heterogeneous, they're multi-scale, as Jim was just saying. And the problem really, I would say, is these pervasive externalities, market failures, and policy failures across the scales from local to global. Rapidly evolving technology and society, and very importantly, diverse and conflicting values and goals in society. And you know, we talk about the economic, environmental, and social dimensions of sustainability, and that's one of the reasons why it is so challenging, because we can't just focus on one part of these issues and the dimensions of sustainability. And in particular, one of the concerns I would have as we think about using circularity as a sort of fundamental principle to move towards sustainable development is that it seems to me it really emphasizes a lot the environmental side. And one of my biggest concerns is that still today we really downplay the social dimensions. Ricardo very rightfully talked about equity, for example, but there are a lot of aspects of in the social dimensions of sustainability. And I am concerned that a lot of the discussions about sustainability really focus on primarily environmental and don't keep in mind that we need to balance the economic with the environmental and social. And the different elements of society have very different values attached to those different dimensions. And so we really face this challenge of balancing and trading off across these different dimensions in ways that are politically acceptable so we actually can move forward. So I think the solution is to use and improve our understanding of these very complex systems to inform research and development and to improve policy design across the relevant scales. And so I thought I would just mention these two examples that we use in our book that highlight some of the challenges we face in all of this and some of what I think are some of the limitations of the circularity concept. One example that I worked on for many years is the semi-subsistence crop livestock systems in sub-Saharan Africa. And this photo shows an example of one of these in Kenya. It's kind of a mini integrated crop livestock system where indeed the nutrients are being recycled. The animals are confined so the manure can be collected, can be composted, be put back on the fields, crop residues can be brought to the animals, and it is indeed a way to integrate the system. But nevertheless, the system loses a lot of nutrients. And what we found in our research is that to really make it more sustainable, in particular to raise farm households' incomes enough to lift them out of poverty, improve their nutrition, one still had to import nutrients from the outside, and one had to export nutrients in the form of grain being sold as a cash crop. So, you know, again, as Ricardo emphasized, sure, these systems can't be completely closed, but I think it also emphasizes that we have to be really careful in using circularity as a kind of, you know, overarching concept, because it has real limitations. And that's true in the industrial crop agricultural systems, for example, in the US. Jim talked about the corn-soybean case that we have worked on with Bruno Basso and others. One I've worked on a lot is the dryland grain systems, wheat-based systems in the north and northwest of the US. And there again, since time's short, I won't elaborate, but I think we can say that, yeah, really a lot of the challenges faced by these systems aren't addressed very effectively by circularity. What both of those examples emphasize is the need for supportive policies to encourage more sustainable practices, as well as appropriate research and development. And I think that is true of many other situations we know that are seriously threatened. For example, most of the irrigated agriculture in the Western US, where extraction of groundwater is clearly unsustainable. Now we can talk about higher scales like Jim and Ricardo did, but there again, you know, sure, you know, it's easy to say, oh, gee, we're not talking about, you know, autarkies. But nevertheless, in a global food system, I think we have to be pretty careful as we think about how we use this idea and what it implies for a global food system and, for example, the trade in feed grains. And finally, I'll just make the point that, you know, I think one of the things we've learned from the history of environmental regulation is that technology mandates are pretty risky, and we don't want to fall into the business of advocating a command and control regulatory approach to solve these problems, like we did in the early days of environmental regulation. So in conclusion, let me just say that I do think circularity, recycling, of course, is a useful concept, but it has its limitations, and I think we have to really think about it critically and carefully as we move forward, trying to move agriculture and food systems towards more sustainable pathways. So thanks very much, Madhu. I'll stop there and pass the baton to Cathy.
Yep. Thanks, John. All right. Our last speaker is Cathy Kling. So, Cathy, it's all yours.
Thanks, everybody. I'll wait for my. I'll start yapping, even though my slides aren't up. Hey, isn't it great to be here in person? It really is. I know lots of people couldn't travel and weren't comfortable, and of course that's fine. But still, it's great to see your masked faces out there and be here. I'm going to take you to a whole different place. You've been all over the world and back again with the last 3 talks. I'm going to take you back to the United States only, and I'm going to talk about water quality and policy. That was my angle, was to talk specifically about policy. And I'm going to use as an example water quality coming from large-scale agriculture. Corn and beans is the example we've heard. Think that in the back of your mind. Water quality is getting increasing press. Increasingly, we are aware of the issues associated with nutrient pollution, nitrogen and phosphorus. We now have all 50 states experiencing harmful algal blooms, which come from nutrients from ag and other sources mixed in water with heat. We are seeing increasing amounts of those. We're failing to meet all designated uses and something like 15,000 water bodies across the US. That's basically not changed in many years. A sister problem is hypoxic zones. This is where these nutrients wind up in the coastal areas, When phytoplankton and algae die, it falls through the water column and uses up oxygen, making it unsuitable for anything to live that can't swim away. This is a NOAA map that shows predictions about the increasing extent of those zones as climate change evolves. Finally, nitrates in drinking water are increasingly a concern to folks worried about people drinking water from wells. Private wells are about 14% of the US population. They are not under any regulation or requirements under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And it's increasingly evident that people drinking from those wells too often do not test and pay attention to nitrate concentrations. I like this picture a lot because I think it reminds us, and everybody in this room knows, the incredible scale of intensively managed agriculture across the United States. Deep green are areas where over 50% of the county or agricultural land is in agriculture. And of course, all that green in the middle is very heavily intensively managed. Corn and beans, where half the year there's nothing on the land, and there's tile drains, and it's very intensive. It's not at all surprising that such a major use of land is going to have a significant amount of externalities. What is U.S. policy about those sources of externalities? Most of U.S. policy is based one way or another on the concept of polluter pays. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act are the main federal mandates for industrial and other sources. They manage these externalities using standards, technology requirements. The kinds of technology requirements John Antle correctly pointed out can often be quite inefficient. But they do meet the standards. They do accomplish the goals, which are to reduce pollution. They are also perfectly consistent with the notion of polluter pays. They are requirements on those who pollute, which then raise their costs of production. That incidence of those costs then, of course, get passed through the supply chain, depending upon supply and demand and what industries we're talking about. And in all of those cases, the potentially high transaction costs associated with not being able to measure and monitor pollution from individual smokestacks, individual sources, individual vehicles did not prevent the United States from implementing policy to require that we meet goals. The story about agriculture is extremely different. There, agriculture is explicitly exempt from the Clean Water Act, except for CAFOs, large confined animal feeding operations, which are treated as a point source like industrial sources of water pollution. Instead, the USDA and other programs pay farmers for voluntary cleanup. The term voluntary, along with the word pay, is a bit of a misnomer to me. Voluntary means you do it because you're wanting and willing to do it. If we're paying people to do it, I actually think we should call this fee for service or something like that, but that is the language. States can regulate. They, for the most part, have chosen not to, although Florida has an amazingly interesting experiment in the 1980s where they required permits for in the Everglades agricultural area to be able to farm at all, and you had to have a set of best management practices or conservation actions. But voluntary, paid or not, remains the dominant approach. What does this all mean about circularity? I use this set of examples and to circle back to my last slide here, which is that I think it's really important to keep our minds on the foundational issues that we as economists can bring to these conversations. I know about efficiency. I'm afraid I don't know much about equity, But I know about efficiency, and I know that efficiency is the friend of sustainability. I also know that when you have pollution externalities that are not controlled, that that's not likely to achieve efficiency from society's perspective. What we can and should do, I think, as economists, is think about foundational fundamentals, maximizing net benefits, or at least minimizing costs to achieve given societal standards. We have a set of societal goals with respect to water quality and water pollution. Our current system of payment for voluntary adoption is not achieving that. And I think that's the conversation we need to be having a lot more of. What could we do to be able to take to scale the kinds of change that's needed on this landscape to achieve societal goals? And I think that circularity only makes sense if it helps us in thinking about solutions to the problems that we, as economists, know something about and really should be the front runners in leading efforts on. So thank you very much. And it is great to see everybody in person.
All right, well, thanks to all our speakers. We are short on time, so, but this was interesting to see how there's a lot of resonance about the fundamental problem that we're dealing with, but how we define it and what aspects we focus on. There's different perspectives, and that is really what the idea of, bringing these perspectives together, and the importance of doing that is important. So I think we'll just take a few questions. There is a chat for the people who are online. You can type in your questions. Those questions, if we can't get to them today, will be available, going forward, and we can have our panelists respond to those online. But maybe we can take one question, in person, and one from an online discussion. And I think we have some AEA representatives here who are going to help us with that. But and there are some mics for the question and answers. So Scott, since you have your hand up, if you'd like to just make your way to one of the mics, and this is right behind you. Yeah, right there.
Well, I think this is a really exciting set of initiatives, and I guess my question, and so I think that there's a tremendous research agenda here that could be developed. An aspect that I find interesting and would like to hear a comment on is this notion of circularity, and as Jim Jones talked about it, and there's some thoughts about accounting approaches like life cycle accounting. And accounting approaches presuppose that you can measure standard processes and that they're replicable. And yet, if we put into place policies that change behavior and change incentives, such as the kinds of outcome-based policies that John and Cathy advocated, then the life cycle accounting changes. So my question is, what do you see as a kind of a research agenda that would help us measure improvements in a circular economy in response to changing incentives?
It's a very tough question. One of the things that we did when I was at the National Science Foundation, we created a new initiative that cuts across different disciplines to be able to better measure and report things at different scales, from a field scale in the soil and water and so forth. And so I think that's really important to be able to know if you're going to be receiving payments for carbon credits or things like that. That has to be confirmed. And so finding these solutions is part of what I think what a lot of the efforts in the production side of thing, the production chain, the supply chain are interested in. But we've also seen, and agree very much with what Cathy said, policies are so important. And getting those right is, I think, why we need the different disciplines to work together. Those of us in the chain and supply chains don't really understand a lot of the equity and policy issues that you deal with. And so finding that balance, I think, I'm optimistic, always optimistic, is something that we can do together. We can land on the moon in a very short period of time. We should be able to address this.
Yep. Yeah, sure. All right. We have one question from Elena Irvin, and this is for Ricardo and for Jim. And she says, your description of circular economy sounds akin to Stefan et al.'s planetary boundaries approach to limiting resource consumption, environmental degradation, which ignores economic and social considerations. Can you comment? Ricardo, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I first of all agree with that, and the reason for that is that I think that we're at very preliminary steps of being able to integrate both of those worlds, and I think that part of Jim's appeal is the absolute necessity of doing that. That's not to discount the importance of each one of those approaches on their own, but it's the integration where, as we just heard the previous questioner outline, there's a very important research agenda to flesh out. Jim?
Yeah, let me follow that. Elena, it's too bad you're not here. It would have been nice to see you here in person, as Cathy pointed out. It's great to be in a live meeting. But the planetary boundaries is one of the incentives, I think, that led the European Union to go in this direction, realizing that there are constraints. And of course, I think any one discipline doesn't really understand all the possibilities that may exist in technology or systems or approaches. And certainly those of us involved in the supply chains, we don't really understand all the policy dimensions and the behavioral concerns and the other economic principles that need to be done. So I think we do not want to ignore economic and social considerations, and that's exactly why, as Ricardo said, we really need to work together on this. We need to get people together, and I think the way you're going to organize this next year maybe would be a good chance for other people working in this area to come together with you to explore this in more detail than we have time to here today.
Yeah. No, certainly. I mean, I think even just starting with clarifying the language around circularity, yes. I think that itself is something, because even though we're trying to explain the same system and the same problem, but how we define it means different things to economists than to other disciplines. And so, you know, so that itself is an agenda. But then thinking about how we can, in fact, collaborate and what that research agenda should look like, you know, is a big task ahead. Cathy, any last thoughts on this or other questions?
I look forward to all you solving all these problems. Go, go.
All right. Well, we'll end it with that. We're out of time, and I know we're taking time away from our Appreciation Club meeting right now. So thank you all for joining this session, and we look forward to more of it. I don't like it. No, I love